So I'm not done painting this yet, but I couldn't pass up the opportunity, and I'm so sorry, in making a video about key poses, but to pose with a key. If you want a character to express themselves, to sum them up in one image, you'll want to create a key pose of the character, and by the end of this video, you'll have the pieces you need to craft a great key pose. A key pose can mean a couple of different things. The word key comes from key frames in animation. Those are the main positions that you're animating towards. And if you look at me go from one side of the screen to the other, the key poses are where I start, the middle, and when I stop. The blurry movements in between are called in-betweens. Yes, a key pose can be a keyframe of animation, but it can also refer to key art, which is usually the single image that a production will use to sum up or market their project. So like an iconic movie poster or image. And when you've created a character design, you might make a turnaround like we did in this video, which I'll link below, but it's just as important to show the character in action, breaking away from that static pose, expressing themselves, or showing off their personality. You might want the perfect image to sum them up for the cover of a comic or a piece of merch like a card or pin. So here are 5 elements of an iconic key pose. We went a little bit more in depth than usual in this video, but please bear with it because I think there's a lot of value here. To start things off, I want to use an example that I think works really well for what we're talking about for several reasons. It's Stitch from Lilo & Stitch. Just a really solid character design, one of the best. How many else of you are suffering the looks like Stitch comments just because of how heavy this guy hits? So it's not just a good design, but a character that plays well in their story, and also, if you haven't noticed, really well in Disney's advertising and merchandising, pins and shirts, etc. So a key pose doesn't mean that there can only be one image of a character that sums them up. You have multiple key poses, especially in something like an animated film like this. And because Stitch changes so much as a character over the course of the film, that's doubly so. So first up, we have the flawed product of a deranged mind, right? That's what the Grand Councilwoman calls him at the beginning. That's this one here. Then we get a glimpse of him as he's still in sort of attack mode when he arrives on Earth, but we get the sense in his expression of just how lost he is. This is his appeal to being a dog. It's a little bit of an odd one, which kind of makes it somewhat important. It's when he first meets Lilo. This is also a pose. You'll see that these screen grabs that I have at the top are all directly from the film, which is a little bit significant. The ones that I have at the bottom here are pulled from Disney's merchandising, so whether it's their pins or their promotional images or things like that. So this is an image that they use pretty prominently with Stitch, but even in the film, it's only part of him that's visible there. Next up here is a notable moment because he's at least making an attempt at not being a monster, and just the Elvis impersonation is a popular moment. The same as being used in this pin here. Here he is as he's surfing. He's got this genuine sense of discovery. He's starting to find his place with a new family. And then next, Stitch lost. He's at his lowest point. He knows what he has to do, but he doesn't have the strength to do it. He just feels like an ugly duckling. And then similar to that, Stitch by the end is pensive, remorseful, no longer lacking a conscience. He's found belonging. And then the scenes after this show him happy and content in his new situation. It's not like this is his new disposition, right? But he's gone through a huge character arc. So each of these poses tells us a different story about a person, or a character in a very different place. Our next few elements will get into the technical and specifics of building key poses, but use story as a motivational factor. Think about the place that your character is in, or what aspect of the character you want to showcase to your audience. Our second element is gesture, and this one is really important. Like we've talked about before, gesture is essentially the imbued motion in a drawing, usually represented by curves. An easy way to understand gesture is with a line from one part of the character to another, emphasizing the most dominant motion. This is usually called a line of action. When a character is unified in this force, it makes for a better pose, whether their body is following that line, whether they're being affected by another force or gravity. It shows where the weight in their character or their body is going. It makes the pose much more dynamic. You're probably also familiar with silhouette, what the flat outline of your character looks like without any interior details. So a silhouette that's easy to read means a strong and iconic key pose. And here's another concept of gesture for you to consider that you may or may not be familiar with. This is of pinched versus stretched. Say we have a straight line, and now we curve that line. So that means that one side of this line has now contracted in on itself, and the other is stretching out. In making this line dynamic instead of static, we've pinched one side and stretched the other. Now let's take that line and build it out into a form. This could be cloth or muscle or skin. Now in making this one side stretched out, we've simplified our stretched side. But now the pinched side is bunching up. Everything is contracting toward the center. We're creating a little bit more detail on the edges. We're also creating contrast. So it's visually appealing to carry this principle into our poses. If we treat our key poses in the same way, not just pinched and stretched, but with one side contrasting with the other, simple versus complex, bumpy versus smooth, pinched versus stretched, you'll have strength and dynamic energy. Okay, bouncing off of the last element is one that I especially see coming up in more novice artists' work, and this has to do with the construction and perspective of their poses. Before that scares you away, we're going to present this in really simple terms. So let's say that we have this silhouette, and just the dark outline of our character, everything looks great. But now we bring in some difficult things, right? There's some things that are definitely wrong with our drawing. All of a sudden, the arms are actually really confusing. Is the arm closest to us moving toward the camera? Is it behind the body? There are lines on our drawing that are contradicting the construction. So we'll do this. We'll find the object or segment of the character that is furthest back from the viewer or the camera, and we'll make a new layer, fill it in as a solid with a color. We won't necessarily care about where it ends, we just need it to cover up, say, our hand in this situation. Then we'll make a new layer and go over top of that with the segment that's next closest to the camera or the viewer, and so on. We're basically creating what's called a depth map, a very simple one, where we just are building up objects, the hierarchy of the objects in the scene. Now it makes a ton of sense what overlaps with what in your character's pose. This should help you understand the hierarchy of objects in your character and should help with the relative size of things. You should be able to go back now and see where those colors are overlapping and find the right way for those constructed either cylinders or cubes, whatever simple shapes your character is made up of, and find the way that they overlap in visual hierarchy much easier. It's always a good idea to start with the gesture to get the vague motions in and then course correct with construction afterwards. Just make sure that things make sense. Number 4, calling back to story, our fourth element is acting. And this has to do with the character's body language and expression. So I have my character Biko here because I have several key poses, all saying something a little bit different. This one here is saying something about how strained Biko is in his role as a support in a really demanding team. This one says something about how resilient he can be despite difficult circumstances. This one says a lot about society. The motion and emotion are pretty drastically different between each of these, and none of them are simply stiff expressions pulled from the character turnaround. A great way to break away from stiff poses is to really sketch and iterate incessantly, with a view to breaking the character or doing something all the way the wrong way. Our eye is actually incredibly forgiving of new elastic shapes, so you can create a shape and then fill your character into it afterwards. If you go too far in a certain direction, you can always course correct, but iterating with intentionally wrong drawings or drawings pushed beyond what you normally expect for your character is a great way to discover new things. And if you feel like your idea for your character is strong in your head but not translating onto the page, literally acting out as the character either in the mirror or with a camera or asking someone to act it out for you so that you can get photo reference isn't cheating or cringe, it's what professionals do, and it's just smart. Our fifth element is a minor one. It's not love, not necessarily applicable in every circumstance, but you can use light and color in the same way that we do pinching versus stretching to call attention to certain areas of our pose and to allow for visual rest or contrast in others. In this illustration of Biko, instead of allowing his whole backpack to call for attention on par with his face and hand, which are the important parts of the pose, we add contrast and emphasis to the important parts of the image by pushing those areas out of the focus of our value range. One quick way to check if we're succeeding in this is to just check what your image looks like in black and white. You can create a gray layer and set it to color over top the rest of your file in any art program, or you can take a picture of your colored painting and then use a filter on your phone. What you're looking for is the values of your colors being too close together or causing confusion. Find your character's story, imbue them with gesture, constantly check their silhouette and their construction, and of course iterate incessantly on these poses until you find something that's just right. Most of the Biko art from this video is from this month's Biko's Biko backpack, an all Biko's backpack. That's a bit of a mouthful. You can get that over on patreon.com/bageldenizen at the Biko's backpack tier, which is now easier to find. And this video is a little bit closer in structure to one of the videos from the Learn Character Design course. It's over 18 hours of comprehensive character design instruction. If you've never even learned to draw before, we get you to a place where you're confident in your skills. You can get that over on learncharacterdesign.com. Thanks so much for watching, and have fun creating.